My name is Ethan Carter, and on the day I graduated from law school, I didn't pop champagne or throw a wild party. I did something most 27-year-olds would never even imagine. I quietly moved my grandparents' entire estate worth over $3 million into an ironclad trust. Why? Because I knew the people who shared my bloodline were the very ones plotting to strip me of everything my grandparents had spent a lifetime building. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But picture this. While my classmates were celebrating with balloons, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Not, "Congratulations, son," not, "We're proud of you." Instead, it was, "Have you had a chance to look at your grandparents' property deeds yet?" That was my reality. Every smile from them carried a shadow. Every visit ended with the same question. "So, how much is the house worth now?" The truth is, my story isn't just about money. It's about betrayal. It's about what happens when the people who should protect you become the predators circling your life. And it's about the desperate promise I made that my grandparents' sacrifices would never be turned into a payday for the family who abandoned us. I still remember standing in my graduation gown looking into the crowd. Most students had parents waving proudly. I scanned the seats, but my mother and father weren't there. They had business opportunities that couldn't wait. What sat in their place front row were the only two people who had ever truly believed in me, Grandma and Grandpa. My grandfather clutched an oxygen tank, fighting through his failing lungs just to see me walk that stage. My grandmother, confused at times from early dementia, still clapped with unrestrained joy every time our eyes met. In that moment, I knew. I couldn't let their love, their entire legacy, fall into greedy hands. That night, while my classmates poured shots, I pored over documents. Pages of deed stocks, savings pieces of paper that could vanish with one signature in the wrong hands. I had seen it happen before. A neighbor, sweet old Mrs. Wilson, lost everything to her son, who manipulated her into signing routine forms. Within weeks, her life savings were gone. Watching her cry in court left a scar on me. I swore I'd never let my grandparents be another victim of that kind of betrayal. So instead of raising a glass, I raised a pen. I signed the documents to create the Carter Family Trust. Every property, every account, every valuable possession shielded from manipulation. To the outside world, nothing looked different. But behind the scenes, I had just built a wall no scam or sob story could breach. It was a decision that would define every battle that came next. Because make no mistake, my family would come. They would come with fake smiles, with fraudulent documents, even with moving trucks. They would come claiming fairness while hiding knives behind their backs. But when they did, they wouldn't be facing the naive kid they once abandoned. They'd be facing someone who knew the law, someone who knew their tricks better than they knew themselves. And when that day finally came, when they stood on the porch, grinning with forged papers in hand, I didn't tremble. I smiled. Because I had been preparing for that exact moment all along. This is not just my story, it's a warning. Family doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought in courtrooms against strangers, but in your own living room against people who share your last name. So before I take you deeper into the betrayals, the lies and the showdown that nearly tore us apart, let me ask, have you ever had to protect yourself from your own family? If you're listening right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It matters more than you think, because stories like these remind us we're not alone in this fight. The first real clash came faster than I expected. Just weeks after I set up the trust, my parents and younger sister showed up at my grandparents' house with the kind of smug confidence that told me they thought they'd already won. My father carried a thick folder of papers, my mother wore that plastic smile she always used when she wanted something, and my sister was practically bouncing phone in hand, ready to record her victory. "Good news," Dad announced as if he were delivering a gift. "The house is in my name now. We'll give you until Friday to clear your things." I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. I just sat there on the porch swing where Grandpa used to sip his coffee every morning, and I smiled. "You really think I would let that happen?" Their faces shifted in an instant. My father's jaw tightened, my mother blinked too quickly, and even my sister's confident grin faltered. It was the first crack in their armor, and in that crack I knew I had the upper hand. But let me take you inside that moment, because the scene wasn't just about words. Behind them, idling on the street, was a moving truck. They had really gone all in, convinced they could walk in with forged documents and strip the house bare before the weekend. The arrogance was staggering. Neighbors peeked from their gardens, some even paused with their lawnmowers, curious to see what drama was about to unfold. My parents didn't care who was watching. They believed this was already theirs. What they didn't know was that every step they took closer to that porch was being recorded on newly installed cameras. Every word they spoke would be documented, preserved, and ready to be played in court if necessary. And waiting inside were people they hadn't expected: lawyers, a notary, and allies, who would make sure their performance ended in humiliation. I remember the way my mother tried to salvage the moment. "Ethan, sweetie," she cooed, her voice dripping with false concern. "We just want to help you. Living in this big house all alone, it must be overwhelming. Why not let us handle things? We can sell it for a fortune and set you up somewhere modern. You'd be so much happier." Her words might have swayed someone else, but I'd spent my life decoding those tones, those manipulations. I could see the greed shining in her eyes even as she tried to disguise it as care. Then my sister chimed in, twirling her hair like she was auditioning for sympathy. "It's only fair," she said with a pointed look. "Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't want you to hog everything. Family should share." Share. That was their justification. Share the wealth, share the history, share the love. Except when I was 5 years old and abandoned, they hadn't shared a thing. When bills piled up, when I needed someone to show up at school, events when my grandparents grew sick, where were they then? Now that everything was worth millions, suddenly sharing mattered. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just let them talk, let them reveal their intentions, while my smile grew sharper. Because here's the truth: when people show you who they really are, your best move isn't to fight their words. It's to quietly prepare the evidence that will destroy them later. And believe me, I was ready. So when they finished their little speech about fairness and family, I simply said, "Before you embarrass yourselves further, you might want to hire a real lawyer, one who can tell the difference between a forged will and an irrevocable trust." My father's face turned crimson. He waved his folder in the air like a sword. "Don't threaten me, boy. I'm your father. You'll respect me." Respect. That word stung, but not in the way he intended. Respect isn't demanded with threats, it's earned with loyalty, with presence, with love. All the things he had never given me. And in that instant, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't the scared child they used to intimidate. I was a lawyer now. I was the trustee of this estate. And most of all, I was the grandson who had promised to protect his grandparents' legacy at all costs. That porch, that house that day, it wasn't just a battleground over money. It was the line in the sand the moment I decided there would be no going back. Whatever storm they brought, I would meet it head on. And to those of you watching, before I dive deeper into how that storm broke, let me pause here and whisper something important. If you've ever had to stand up to people you thought you could trust, drop a comment below and tell me your story. And if this feels close to home, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, you'll want to hear how this fight unfolded. Growing up, I didn't have the kind of childhood most kids picture when they think of family. I didn't wake up to parents making pancakes on Saturdays or cheering at my soccer games. My parents were gone, chasing money, chasing schemes, chasing freedom from responsibility. The people who actually raised me, who stood in the bleachers, who taught me right from wrong, were my grandparents. My earliest memories are of my grandmother humming in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon rolls filling the air. She would tap me gently on the shoulder and say, "Rise and shine, little lawyer." At 5 years old, I didn't know what she meant, but her voice carried such certainty that one day I believed it. My grandfather was a man of patience. He took me to the pond at the park with a fishing rod that seemed twice my size. I tangled the line 100 times, but he never raised his voice. "Your word is your bond," he'd tell me later at night as we read side by side in his study. "Break it, and you lose something you can never buy back." That was his worldview, honor above everything. It was in that Victorian house, passed down through 3 generations, that I learned what family truly meant. Not bloodlines, not last names, but daily sacrifices. My grandparents weren't wealthy in spirit because of the estate. They were wealthy because of the way they poured themselves into me. Every book they bought instead of a new phone, every trip to a museum instead of a theme park, every quiet night reading together, they were shaping me, building me in ways I didn't understand until much later. When you're a kid, you don't realize the magnitude of those moments. You just know you feel safe. Safe when Grandma placed an extra muffin in your lunch bag. Safe when Grandpa checked under the bed for monsters. Safe when they showed up, always showed up. That safety became my anchor, something I clung to whenever the phone rang. And it was my parents on the line asking for money, not memories. Because, yes, they did call. Sometimes twice a year around Christmas, or when rent was due on some condo they couldn't afford. They'd show up with exaggerated hugs and questions like, "How's Grandpa's portfolio doing these days?" I was just a kid, but even then I felt the hollowness behind their smiles. They weren't there to see me. They were there to scout, to probe, to take. It wasn't always obvious to outsiders. On the surface, my parents were charming. My mom with her slick business pitches for miracle diet pills, my dad with his endless can't-miss investments. But behind the curtain, there were bankruptcies, unpaid loans, and a trail of people left worse off than before. I knew it, my grandparents knew it, and eventually the whole neighborhood knew it too. And then there was my sister. 7 years younger, she was the one they kept. The baby, the one they claimed they couldn't part with. She grew up watching their every move, learning entitlement, practicing manipulation until it became second nature. By the time she was a teenager, she had already stolen money from my piggy bank, smiling sweetly, as if it were nothing. I can still hear my grandmother's voice, gentle but firm. She should come live with us too. But my parents refused. They wanted her close because she demanded so little actual parenting. This contrast between the love that raised me and the neglect that defined them set the stage for everything that came later. It explained why I trusted my grandparents with my life, but never trusted my parents with a single document. It explained why I could sit calmly on that porch years later when they tried to steal the estate. Because I knew the truth, one side of my family built me up, and the other side spent decades trying to tear everything down. And as I tell you this, I want you to think about something. We often measure family by titles: mom, dad, sister. But ask yourself who showed up when you needed them, who sacrificed for you even when it cost them. Those are your real family, no matter what the DNA says. Looking back, those quiet mornings with muffins, those evenings with books, those long afternoons fishing, they weren't just happy memories. They were the foundation of the person I would become. They gave me the courage to fight later when the people who should have been my protectors turned into predators. And that's the irony, isn't it? My parents abandoned me at 5 years old, and in doing so, they accidentally gave me the greatest gift of all time, with the two people who taught me the meaning of integrity, love, and legacy. Because when the storm finally came, when greed showed up at my doorstep, I wasn't fighting alone. I was fighting with every lesson, every memory, every word my grandparents had etched into my heart. If you want to understand why the battle for the estate was inevitable, you have to see the stark contrast that defined my family. On one side stood my grandparents, the steady hands that fed, clothed, and guided me. On the other side were my parents and my younger sister, people who could sniff out money the way sharks scent blood in water. My parents floated in and out of my childhood like strangers who had the wrong address. They weren't present for milestones, but they always seemed to appear right before Christmas or around tax season. Their pattern was as predictable as clockwork: big hugs, exaggerated affection, followed by a round of subtle interrogation. "So how are Grandpa's investments doing this year?" my mother would ask as she slid her designer purse onto the kitchen counter. My father would chime in with comments about the housing market, the incredible demand for historic properties. And after dessert, the performance always ended the same way, with some heartbreaking story about unexpected expenses. A failed business deal, an urgent loan, a car that needed replacing. They'd take what they could promise repayment and vanish until the next crisis. It would have been sad if it weren't so transparent. By the time I was 10, Dad had already filed bankruptcy twice, dragging my mother through failed schemes like timeshares, miracle health products, and fake consulting firms. Their marriage wasn't a partnership built on love. It was a hustle, two con artists working the same grift and calling it family life. And then there was my sister, 7 years younger, the child they decided was worth keeping. Valerie didn't grow up with bedtime stories or lessons about honor. She grew up watching my parents manipulate people, learning every trick, perfecting entitlement. By the time she was 15, she was already stealing from my room, when she visited, smirking, when she thought she'd gotten away with it. I remember one particular visit that crystallized everything. My parents had dropped Valerie off for the weekend. At first, she was sugary sweet playing board games with me and pretending to help Grandma in the kitchen. But on Saturday morning, I found my piggy bank, cracked open bills, missing coins scattered on the floor. Valerie shrugged, her voice laced with the same nonchalance I recognized from my mother. You had extra. I needed it more. Grandma's eyes filled with tears that day. She tried to convince my parents to let Valerie move in with us permanently to break the cycle before it became permanent. But my parents refused. She's our baby, they insisted. The truth was simpler, they wanted her nearby because she demanded so little actual parenting. Every encounter after that just widened the gap between the family that raised me and the family that claimed me. My grandparents gave me tools, honesty, hard work, responsibility. My parents gave me burdens, doubt, fear, and the constant reminder that blood doesn't guarantee love. Even as my grandparents grew older, the divide sharpened. Dad started calling more often, asking not about me, but about my grandparents' health. How's Dad holding up these days? Still handling the property taxes okay? His tone wasn't concern, it was reconnaissance. Mom would send links to retirement communities suggesting the house was too much for them. Every word was a hint, a push, a veiled attempt to pry open the door to their assets. The truth was impossible to ignore. The closer my grandparents came to their twilight years, the more my parents circled like vultures measuring the distance between death and opportunity. And my sister, she became their eager apprentice, her eyes lighting up whenever she spotted antiques or jewelry in the house. She wasn't just watching anymore, she was plotting, taking mental notes, waiting for the day she thought she'd cash in. To outsiders, it might have looked like family tension. To me, it was a slow-motion heist. A robbery being prepared not by strangers, but by the very people who should have cared for my grandparents as much as I did. That's why when people later asked how I could stand so calm on that porch, facing down my father's threats and my mother's lies, I tell them this: I'd been watching that scene play out my entire life. Every half-truth, every fake smile, every unpaid loan, it all pointed to this confrontation. By the time they finally marched up my front steps with forged papers and smug grins, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even angry. I was ready. And maybe that's the hardest truth to accept sometimes. You can see betrayal coming years before it arrives. You feel it in every fake hug, every whispered question about money, every moment someone chooses greed over love. And when that day comes, when the people you call family finally reveal themselves, you have two choices: let them take everything, or build a wall strong enough that even blood can't break through. The seed that grew into my career as a lawyer was planted one afternoon when I was 17. It wasn't in a classroom or a library, it was on the porch of our neighbors, the Wilsons, as I watched them collapse under the weight of betrayal. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were kind elderly people who lived 2 streets over. They treated me like a grandson, often waving me in for lemonade after school. But that spring, everything changed. Their own son, flesh and blood, had convinced them to sign over power of attorney. They thought they were giving him authority to help with bills. Instead, he emptied their accounts. Overnight, decades of savings were gone. I can still see Mrs. Wilson's face streaked with tears as movers carted away her furniture. "He promised us we'd be taken care of," she whispered. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, furious and powerless. If blood could betray them, what chance did my grandparents have with parents like mine circling closer every year? That moment stayed with me. It wasn't just sadness, it was clarity. I realized then that family didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it meant danger in its most deceptive form. From that day forward, I wanted to understand the laws that could stop predators hiding in plain sight. I didn't just want a career, I wanted armor. Fast forward a few years, I was in law school, surrounded by students who dreamed of climbing corporate ladders, arguing high-profile cases, or joining elite firms. My dream was different. I wanted to protect people like the Wilsons, like my grandparents, people who had everything to lose and trusted the wrong hands. That's why when I walked across the graduation stage, I wasn't just holding a diploma. I was holding a weapon. Knowledge sharp enough to cut through lies, strategy strong enough to outmaneuver con artists, and a promise to my grandparents that they would never be left vulnerable. But I wasn't just shaped by that one moment with the Wilsons. Every sacrifice my grandparents made deepened my resolve. When I was 16, I got my first job at the local library shelving books for minimum wage. I told myself it was to help with my own expenses, but truthfully, I knew prescription bills and property taxes were eating away at their savings. "Ethan, you don't need to work," Grandma said gently when she found me in my dusty uniform. But I saw the worry in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I saw Grandpa quietly calculating bills at the kitchen table. They had already given me so much, it was my turn to give something back. Their lessons carried me through the darkest nights in law school. While others partied, I stayed home, highlighting case studies in estate fraud and elder abuse. One professor, a woman named Sarah Winters, said something that burned itself into my memory. 70% of elder financial abuse comes from family members or caregivers. Betrayal is the real epidemic. When I heard that, I felt the ground shift under me. 70%. I thought of my parents' phone calls, their sudden concern every time Grandpa had a doctor's appointment. I thought of Valerie's sticky fingers in my piggy bank. And I knew this wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. That's why the day I officially became a lawyer, the first legal document I drafted wasn't for a client. It was for my grandparents, the Carter Family Trust. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my neighbors, not even some of my professors. It was a secret shield, invisible to outsiders, but indestructible where it mattered most. And now, looking back, I can say this, that trust didn't just protect money. It protected memories, history, sacrifice. It ensured that the laughter of my grandparents wouldn't be reduced to a dollar sign on a balance sheet. So when my parents later came knocking with fake wills and fraudulent deeds, they weren't just testing my patience. They were testing the very lessons my grandparents had poured into me, to stand tall, to fight smart, and to never let anyone rewrite the truth. And before I go on, let me pause and ask you, if you were in my shoes watching your own family circle, like vultures, would you have done the same? Or would you have trusted blood even when your instincts screamed not to? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear how you would handle it. Because the choices we make in those moments don't just define our future, they reveal who we really are. The warning signs were always there. It just took me a while to realize how dangerous they really were. As my grandparents' health began to decline, my parents' sudden interest in their lives became impossible to ignore. The calls started coming more often. At first, it seemed almost normal, my dad checking in, asking how Grandpa was doing after a doctor's appointment. But the questions always twisted, sliding toward money. Is he still paying property taxes on time? Has he talked to anyone about selling? You know, it'd be smart to cash out before the market dips. It was never about care, never about love. It was reconnaissance. Then came my mother's emails. Not letters filled with affection, but links to glossy retirement communities. She'd write lines like, "This place would be so much easier for them. Think about how much stress it would save you." But behind her words was another meaning. Sell the house. Free up the assets. Hand over the legacy. And Valerie, my sister, wasn't just watching anymore. She was testing the waters, slipping jewelry into her bag, when she thought no one noticed, asking questions about antiques, pretending it was innocent curiosity. I'd catch her running her fingers across Grandma's silver tea-set eyes, narrowing the way a buyer examines merchandise. It all escalated after Grandpa's first heart surgery. My father showed up that weekend, pacing around the living room, touching the walls, the furniture. He wasn't visiting a sick man. He was surveying property like a realtor with commission on the line. My mother, meanwhile, whispered to Grandma about how overwhelming the house must be for her. The moment I walked into the room, they clammed up, smiles plastered across their faces. The tension was unbearable. Every family visit felt like a business meeting in disguise. Grandma would twist her wedding ring, anxious but silent. Grandpa tried to brush it off. "He's still my son, Ethan," but his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I think he saw it too. For me, the shift was like a storm front moving in. The air changed. Every phone call rattled me. Every email felt like another claw reaching closer. My classmates were worrying about exams. I was lying awake, wondering if my parents would convince my grandparents to sign away the house in a moment of weakness. And the scariest part, they almost succeeded. One evening, I was helping Grandpa on his computer when I stumbled across an email my father had forgotten to delete. It was addressed to a real estate agent, asking about comps in the neighborhood, calculating what our home might fetch on the market. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just fantasizing about it, he was making plans. I showed it to Grandma first. Her face crumpled. "He borrowed $50,000 years ago," she whispered. said he needed it for a business deal. He promised to pay it back, but when we asked, he got angry. Said we owed him for raising you. Her voice cracked as tears fell onto her hands. That night I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to act. Still part of me resisted. These were my parents after all. There was a flicker of hope. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they wouldn't cross the line. But when I looked at Grandpa pale and exhausted, and Grandma wringing her hands as if trying to keep herself from unraveling, I knew. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. That was the moment I began drafting the trust in earnest. Every late-night lecture about estate law, every case study I'd underlined about financial exploitation, they weren't abstract anymore. They were a playbook for saving the only family that ever truly loved me. The irony was suffocating. My parents thought they were circling in silence, waiting for the right moment to pounce. They had no idea I was already building the walls they would soon crash against. And here's the truth. When betrayal comes from blood, it cuts deeper than any stranger ever could. But it also makes you sharper, stronger. You stop waiting for loyalty to appear where it never will, and you start protecting what matters most. I hadn't told them yet, but the Carter family trust was already forming in my mind, brick by legal brick. And when the time came, I would be ready. The day everything snapped into focus was supposed to be ordinary. It was a Sunday late afternoon, the kind of quiet time when Grandma would normally be in the kitchen rolling out pie dough, and Grandpa would be in his recliner with the newspaper. But when I walked in that day, the air felt heavy like a storm had already passed through. Grandma sat at the table, her hands trembling as she clutched a letter. Grandpa's eyes, once sharp, once full of humor, looked hollow. He didn't even look up at me when I set down my backpack. Ethan, Grandma whispered, sliding the paper across the table. We need you to explain this. It was a draft contract, typed formal with all the right legal jargon. My parents' names were at the top, and so was Valerie's. The document was a proposal for a family asset restructuring plan. Innocent words masking a brutal truth. They wanted the house. They wanted control of the savings. They wanted everything. For a moment, I just stared at the page, the words blurring. Then my chest tightened. The trust I'd been secretly building in law school wasn't just a precaution anymore. It was the only barrier standing between my grandparents and financial ruin. I looked at Grandpa, frail but proud. Did you sign anything? His voice cracked. They brought it yesterday. Said it was to make sure you wouldn't be overburdened when we're gone. We told them we'd think about it. That was when I realized they were targeting me as much as them. My parents were trying to twist it to frame their scheme as some kind of gift. Ethan won't have to worry, we'll handle everything. But what they meant was Ethan won't have a say because we'll strip it all away first. I felt heat rise in my chest, anger burning through my veins. You can't sign this. Not now. Not ever. Grandma's eyes filled with tears. We thought maybe it would keep the peace. They're our children, Ethan. They're not acting like children, I snapped before I could stop myself. They're acting like predators. Silence hung between us. Then Grandma folded the paper as if trying to hide it from the world. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The sound of the old clock ticking was the only thing keeping me steady. I opened the file I'd been working on for months, the Carter Family Trust, and I made it real. I typed in their names, the property deed, the bank account details. I drafted clauses so tight no one could wriggle through. Every line was a wall, every signature a lock, and with every keystroke, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about protecting assets. It was about protecting dignity. It was about saying you don't get to decide what love looks like. You don't get to rewrite our family's story. But make no mistake, fear not at me. What if I wasn't strong enough? What if my parents found another way? My law degree was still new. My parents had decades of experience manipulating, pressuring, deceiving. Yet I remembered Mrs. Wilson's tears years ago, the hollow look in her eyes after her son stole her life savings. I remembered swearing to myself I'd never let that happen again, not to the people I loved. That vow was my fuel. By dawn, the trust was finished. My grandparents didn't know it yet, but I had built a fortress around them. The house, the savings, their small treasures untouchable. My parents could pound on the walls, but they would never break through. When I finally closed my laptop, exhaustion hit me like a wave. But under the fatigue was a strange calm. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. And yet I knew the battle wasn't over. Signing the trust was only the beginning. My parents weren't the kind to slink away quietly. If anything, they'd fight harder. And I couldn't shake the thought, how far would they go to get what they wanted? The morning after I finalized the trust, I woke with a knot in my stomach. It wasn't just nerves, it was the sense that I had stepped into a game where every move counted and the other players were willing to cheat at any cost. I sat my grandparents down at the dining room table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains that had been there since before I was born. Grandma looked wary, her hands folded tight in her lap. Grandpa coughed softly, waiting for me to begin. "Listen," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I know you've been under a lot of pressure. Mom and Dad want you to sign that contract. But what they aren't telling you is it gives them complete control over your money, your home, everything." Grandma's lips pressed thin. "But they're our children, Ethan. Maybe they just want to help." I leaned forward. "Do you really believe that you've seen how they've acted? Dad's already contacting real estate agents. Valerie's pocketing jewelry like it's hers. That contract isn't help, it's theft dressed up as family care." The room went silent. Grandpa finally spoke, his voice trembling. "So what do we do?" I slid a stack of papers across the table. "This. I've created a trust. It locks the house, the accounts, all of it. No one can touch it without your permission. Not even me. If you sign, everything is safe." Grandma's eyes welled up. "Safe," she whispered, as if the word itself were fragile. But before relief could settle, reality crashed back in. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "We'll be by this evening. Have the papers ready." I felt my pulse spike. They weren't giving up, they were escalating. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV pulled up, doors slamming in practiced unison. My parents emerged first, polished and smiling like wolves in Sunday clothes. Valerie followed, clutching a leather folder too big for her hands. The living room felt suddenly small as they filed in. My father spread the contract across the coffee table with a flourish. "It's simple," he said, his voice dripping with feigned warmth. "This keeps everything neat and organized. No confusion for Ethan later." I stood between them and my grandparents. "They're not signing," I said flatly. My mother's smile cracked. "Ethan, sweetie, this isn't your decision. You don't understand how complicated these things are." "I understand perfectly," I shot back. "You're trying to steal from them." Grandma gasped softly, but my parents didn't even flinch. My father's eyes narrowed. "Watch your mouth. You think that little law degree makes you smarter than us?" Valerie piped up, voice sharp. "If they don't sign, it'll just drag out later. The courts will get involved." "Do you really want to put them through that, Ethan?" For a second, I felt my resolve waver. They were practiced manipulators, rehearsed in turning doubt into surrender. But then I looked at Grandma, clutching Grandpa's hand, fear etched into her face. And something inside me hardened. I walked to the desk, pulled out the trust documents, and placed them beside the contract. "They're signing these," I said. "Not yours." The room froze. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hands clenched around her purse strap. Valerie's eyes flicked between the two stacks of papers like she couldn't comprehend losing. Then Grandpa, in his quiet, steady way, reached for a pen. His hand shook, but his signature was deliberate. Grandma followed, tears sliding down her cheeks. The trust was sealed. "You'll regret this," my father hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Maybe I would. Maybe the fight had only just begun. But in that moment, I knew something my parents didn't. They had underestimated me. They thought I was just the kid they raised, the one who could be bullied into silence. They hadn't realized I'd grown teeth. As their SUV roared away into the night, I stood at the window clutching the trust. My hands still shook, but not from fear, from resolve. The war for my family's legacy had started, and I wasn't backing down. I thought signing the trust would bring peace, a kind of invisible shield protecting my grandparents from everything my parents could throw at them. But the truth was, it only lit the fuse. Within days, the retaliation began. It started small, subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Valerie posted on Facebook hinting that I was manipulating Grandma, and Grandpa isolating them, keeping them from their true family. Old neighbors saw the posts shared, them whispered. Then came the phone calls. Aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years rang, voices sharp with accusation. "Why are you cutting everyone out? Why won't you let your parents handle things?" I wanted to scream, to shout the truth into the phone, but every time I bit my tongue. Explaining felt like stepping into quicksand. The more I tried to clarify, the deeper the lies pulled me down. One evening, after yet another call that left me shaking with anger, Grandma touched my shoulder. "Ethan," she said softly, "we know the truth. That's enough." But was it? The smear campaign escalated. My father, ever the strategist, found a way to weaponize his business contacts. Suddenly, rumors circulated in the community, stories about me flunking out of law school, about debts I didn't have, even about criminal investigations that didn't exist. It was character assassination, and it was working. I could see it in the way people avoided me at the grocery store, in the tight-lipped smiles that never reached their eyes. Then came the worst blow. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a crisp white envelope. Inside a formal notice. My parents were contesting the trust in court. They claimed undue influence, arguing I had coerced my grandparents into signing away their freedom. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the page, my chest heavy, my breath shallow. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was war on paper. That night, pacing the living room, I felt my resolve tremble. The thought nagged at me, what if they win? What if the court believes them? Judges aren't immune to manipulation, and my parents were experts at painting themselves as victims. I almost gave in to despair. Almost. But then a different thought sparked. What if this is my chance? What if instead of fearing their tactics, I use this battle to expose them? That became my lifeline. I doubled down, digging into every precedent, every case of elder financial abuse I could find. I worked late into the night, my textbook spread across the dining table, notes scribbled in the margins. I wasn't just defending my grandparents, I was building a case that could rip the mask off my parents in front of the whole world. And in the middle of that storm, I did something unexpected. I picked up my camera. I started filming small clips, short, raw recordings of my grandparents talking about their lives, their choices, their reasons for signing the trust. Not rehearsed, not polished, just truth. I didn't know yet how I'd use the footage, but something told me it mattered. By the time our first court date loomed, I felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. My parents thought this would break me. They thought dragging me into the legal arena would force me to fold. But they forgot one thing: this was my arena now. And to anyone watching this, let me pause here, because if you've ever been in a situation where people twist lies against you, where the people closest to you become your greatest threat, you know how isolating it feels. But you're not alone. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever faced something similar, because trust me, there's power in speaking out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel is where we turn pain into strength, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Because next, the courtroom would become the stage where every secret, every lie, every buried truth about my parents would finally come to light. And deep down, I was ready to let the world see who they really were. The courthouse smelled like dust and cold marble, a mix of history and judgment. I walked through its doors that morning with my grandparents on either side of me, their hands trembling but their chins lifted. I could feel the weight of what we were walking into. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was our family's soul on trial. Inside, my parents were already waiting. My father in his tailored suit, his tie the color of blood. My mother draped in pearls, eyes glinting with false sorrow. Valerie sat beside them, scrolling on her phone, smirking as if she'd already won. When the judge called the session to order, my father rose like a man stepping into a spotlight. His voice was smooth, confident, rehearsed. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because our son has taken advantage of two vulnerable elderly people. He has isolated them, manipulated them, and coerced them into signing documents they didn't understand." Every word was poison, and yet it dripped from his tongue like honey. I clenched my fists under the table. Then it was my turn. I stood, my voice trembling at first, but gaining strength. "Your Honor, the truth is much simpler. My grandparents aren't victims. They're victims of my parents' greed, not of me. They signed those documents willingly after years of being pressured, threatened, and stripped of dignity. What I did wasn't coercion. It was protection." The judge's eyes flicked between us, unreadable. The trial stretched on for hours. My parents paraded their lies, producing friends who swore they'd seen me controlling my grandparents, keeping them hidden. They painted a picture of me as some scheming puppet master, twisting my grandparents into giving me everything. But then I called my witnesses. First, the neighbor who'd seen Valerie sneaking jewelry out of the house. Then the nurse who testified about my mother's harshness toward Grandma during hospital visits. Piece by piece, I built a different picture, not of me as the manipulator, but of them as predators circling their prey. Finally, I played the recordings. Clips of my grandparents sitting in their living room, voices steady and clear. "We want this trust," Grandpa said into the camera. "We are tired of being pressured. We are tired of living in fear. This is our choice." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, my parents' masks slipped. My mother's jaw tightened. My father's eyes narrowed to slits. Valerie dropped her phone, the clatter echoing in the stillness. The judge leaned forward. "This testimony is compelling," he said carefully. "I see no evidence of coercion. What I do see is a family in conflict, one driven by control and entitlement." Relief surged through me, but I kept my face calm. This wasn't victory yet, it was only the beginning. As the gavel struck to close the day's hearing, my father shot me a look so sharp it could cut glass. "This isn't over," his eyes said. And I believed him. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I felt both lighter and heavier at once. The trust had survived the first attack, but I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Predators don't give up when you block their path, they find another way around. Still, I had learned something important that day. Lies are powerful, yes, but truth, when spoken plainly, when backed by courage, cuts deeper than deception ever could. And if you're watching this stuck in your own battle with people who twist the truth against you, remember this: the fight is never easy, but standing for what's right will always matter. Stick with me. Subscribe if you haven't, because what comes next will show you just how far people will go when power slips through their fingers. Because court wasn't the end of my parents' war, it was only their opening act. If court was their stage, then what came next was their ambush. My parents had always thrived in the shadows, whisper campaigns, subtle threats, the kind of attacks that leave no fingerprints. But after losing ground in court, they switched tactics. They went public. It started with an op-ed in the local paper, written, of course, by Valerie, though published under some concerned citizen pseudonym. The headline screamed, "Greedy grandson exploits, elders, where is justice?" The article painted me as a parasite, leeching off my grandparents while playing the role of savior. It spread like wildfire, especially once my father's business associates shared it across social media. Soon strangers were knocking on my door, some with pity in their eyes, others with disgust. "Why would you do that to your grandparents?" one woman hissed at me in the grocery store aisle. My face burned. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep walking. Grandma, on the other hand, didn't. She clipped the article, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her Bible. "Let them print lies," she told me. "Paper burns. Truth doesn't." Her calm steadied me, but the storm outside only grew fiercer. One night, as I walked to my car, I noticed the tires had been slashed. Another morning, graffiti streaked across our garage. "Thief." My heart hammered each time, a mix of fear and fury. My parents had stopped pretending. But here's the twist: instead of hiding, I leaned into the light. I launched a blog. At first, it was just to document what was happening, our side of the story, in our words. But the response shocked me. Messages poured in from people across the country, sons and daughters, neighbors, even former caregivers. They shared their own experiences of elder exploitation, their own battles with families that turned toxic over money. I realized something powerful: my story wasn't just mine. It was part of a pattern too many people lived, but never spoke about. That gave me a new kind of fire. So I started posting videos, short, unpolished, raw clips, where I spoke straight to camera. I didn't just expose my parents' behavior. I talked about the larger problem, about protecting elders, about breaking cycles of silence. I spoke about fear and betrayal, but also about resilience. And to my surprise, people listened. That's when the threats changed tone. Valerie sent me a message late one night. "Stop talking or we'll make you stop." My hands shook as I read it, but I refused to delete it. Evidence, I told myself. Every weapon they used, I would turn into proof. The pressure built until I could hardly sleep. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd gone too far. Was I endangering my grandparents by refusing to back down? Was I sacrificing peace for pride? But then one night at dinner, Grandpa reached across the table, his old hands warm on mine. "Don't stop, Ethan," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "For years we thought we had to suffer in silence. You've given us a voice. You've given us our dignity back." That moment changed me. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't even about protecting the inheritance. It was about reclaiming freedom for them, for me, for everyone watching who had been silenced by fear. And I want to pause here speaking to you because maybe you're carrying your own storm. Maybe you've been slandered. Maybe you've been pressured to stay quiet. Don't. Share your story in the comments below. Speak it, write it, whisper it if you must, but don't bury it. And if you're new here, subscribe. This is where silence ends. Because the truth, my parents hadn't even played their deadliest card yet. And when they did, it wouldn't just threaten my reputation. It would threaten everything I thought I knew about myself. I thought the worst they could do was smear my name, maybe drag me through endless court hearings. But what came next hit harder than I ever imagined. It was personal, it was calculated, and it was meant to destroy me from the inside out. It began with a phone call late at night. My cousin, the only one in the extended family who still spoke to me, whispered urgently into the receiver, "Ethan, they're digging into your past. Old school records, old employers. They're building something." At first I laughed bitterly. What past? I've never even had a speeding ticket. But then the first email arrived. An anonymous account sent my boss a packet of evidence photos doctored to make it look like I'd stolen equipment from work, falsified documents showing I'd mismanaged funds. My job called me in for questioning. The humiliation was suffocating. Sitting across from HR, watching them leaf through pages of lies about me, it was like drowning in quicksand. I knew where it came from. My parents had money connections and a ruthless daughter in Valerie who knew her way around Photoshop better than anyone. I left that meeting shaking my chest tight, my future suddenly fragile. When I told my grandparents, Grandma's eyes filled with tears. "They'll stop at nothing," she whispered. Grandpa, however, only clenched his jaw. "Then we stop pretending this is just about money," he said. "This is war. But here's the thing about war, you can't win if you only play defense." So I gathered everything, every threatening message, every doctored image, every neighbor's testimony. I hired a forensic expert to tear the fake documents apart, layer by digital layer. Slowly, I built a case not just of innocence, but of targeted harassment. And while all this unfolded, I kept posting. The blog, the videos, they weren't just my outlet anymore, they were my shield. Each time they hit me, I hit back with transparency. I laid out their tactics, showed my audience how lies are crafted, how power is abused. And something incredible happened. Strangers rallied. Lawyers offered free advice. Digital security experts volunteered their time. People who had been silent victims for years wrote messages like, "Seeing you fight makes me want to fight too." But the tension inside me was unbearable. Every night as I locked the doors and checked the windows, I asked myself, what if they're right? What if people believe them more than me? Because let's be honest, once a lie is spoken, it leaves a stain. Even when you wash it clean, some people only remember the dirt. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the porch with Grandpa. The summer air was heavy, cicadas screaming in the trees. He lit his pipe, took a long drag, and said, "Ethan, you can't fight this battle to be liked. You fight it to be free. Freedom doesn't come from everyone believing you. It comes from you refusing to bow even when they don't." Those words sank deep. And I knew this was no longer about clearing my name. It was about refusing to let them cage me with fear. And before I take you deeper, I want to say this directly to you, watching. Don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Comment below if you've ever had someone twist your story into a weapon against you. Your truth deserves daylight. Because here's what I didn't know that night on the porch: my parents weren't finished. They had one more move, one so dark that when I discovered it, I realized the fight wasn't just for dignity or reputation anymore. It was for survival. I woke the next morning to silence, too much silence. Normally my phone buzzed, nonstop messages from supporters, comments on my videos, updates from the lawyer. But that day, nothing. Not one notification. Confused, I checked online. My blog was gone, deleted, my social accounts vanished. Every post, every video, every piece of evidence I'd shared wiped clean. Panic shot through me like ice water. This wasn't a glitch. This was a strike. My parents had pulled their darkest card yet. Later, I learned how they'd filed bogus complaints, claiming I was spreading false information, harassing elderly family members, even inciting threats. They had money, lawyers, and influence. They knew exactly how to manipulate the system. Platforms took down my accounts without question. It was devastating. My voice, my shield, my lifeline, it was gone overnight. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my dead phone while Grandma brewed coffee in silence. Finally, she set the cup in front of me, her hand resting gently on mine. "They want to silence you," she said, "so you make noise louder than ever." But how without my online platforms I felt like a ghost. That's when Grandpa of all people gave me the answer. He shuffled into the room holding a stack of old flyers from his union days. Back then, he said, when they tried to shut us down, we printed truth on paper. We put it in hands. We knocked on doors. We marched. At first, I almost laughed. Paper flyers in 2025. But then it hit me the point wasn't the medium. It was the persistence. So I pivoted. I rebuilt. I created new accounts under different names. I partnered with advocates I'd met online, people who had bigger followings and could amplify my story. I started holding community meetings at the library, speaking in person about elder rights. Neighbors showed up, reporters showed up. The story grew, not shrank. And the more they tried to erase me, the more people wanted to know why. But here's the twist: Valerie couldn't stand being sidelined. One evening, as I walked to my car after a community meeting, she stepped out from the shadows. Her smile was sharp, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you're winning, you're not. You're embarrassing yourself. Mom and Dad won't stop until you're nothing. And if you don't back down, you won't just lose your name. You'll lose them too." I froze. Lose who? Her smile widened. "The grandparents you're so proud to protect." That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words weren't idle threats. I knew her well enough to recognize when she was bluffing and when she wasn't. And this time, her eyes had carried a deadly promise. The next week confirmed my fear. My grandparents' mail was tampered with. Fake medical bills appeared in their box. Strangers loitered near their house watching. Pressure, intimidation, terror, it was all aimed at pushing me to fold. And yet, as terrifying as it was, I felt something stronger than fear rising in me, defiance. Because the truth was, this every tactic they used only exposed them more. Every lie, every smear, every threat was proof of how far they'd fallen. And I wasn't about to let them drag my grandparents into their pit. I want to pause here because maybe you've felt this kind of pressure too. The suffocating weight of people trying to silence you, twist your life, make you doubt your own strength. Don't let them win. Share your story below, subscribe if you haven't, because silence only helps the abusers. Together we can be louder. But I didn't know then how close I was to the breaking point. The next move they made would shatter every illusion I had left. It wouldn't just test my courage, it would reveal the darkest secret buried inside my own family's history. And once that secret surfaced, there would be no going back. The secret came to me in the most unexpected way. An envelope slipped under my door. No return address, no handwriting I recognized. Just my name printed in sharp black ink. Inside were photocopies, legal documents, old bank statements, hospital files. My hands trembled as I shuffled through them. At first it was a blur of numbers and jargon, but then I saw it. A trust fund, established when I was a child, millions of dollars, my name as the sole beneficiary, and in the corner, the signatures my parents. Except, they weren't signatures of love, they were signatures of theft. The documents showed a trail money siphoned accounts, drained transactions hidden in shell companies. For years, they had been feeding off what was rightfully mine. I sat there in stunned silence. My parents hadn't just disowned me. They hadn't just smeared my name. They had stolen my future before I even had a chance to live it. Suddenly, everything made sense. Their obsession with control, their desperate attempts to silence me, their hatred of my independence. If I exposed them, it wouldn't just ruin their reputation. It would unravel decades of financial fraud. And Valerie, she wasn't just the dutiful daughter. She was the accomplice signing off on transfers, laundering money through her business ventures. I felt sick, betrayed in a way I didn't have words for. That night, I confronted Grandma and Grandpa. Their faces told me everything they had known, pieces of this truth, but had been powerless to stop it. Tears slid down Grandma's cheeks as she whispered, "We wanted to protect you." But they threatened to cut us off completely if we said anything. Grandpa, his voice trembling with both rage and regret, said, "Son, this isn't just family drama anymore. This is criminal, and you have the proof." I stared at the stack of papers, the weight of history pressing on my chest. For the first time, I understood this wasn't just about me. It was about every person they had, cheated, manipulated, crushed under their need for power. The next morning, I made a choice. I walked into a lawyer's office, slid the documents across the table, and said I want to press charges. The lawyer flipped through the files, her eyebrows rising higher with every page. Finally, she looked at me, her voice steady. If this holds up, it won't just be a lawsuit. It'll be federal. The magnitude of it hit me like a tidal wave. My parents, respected in their community, admired in their circles, were about to be exposed as thieves, and I was the one lighting the fuse. But fear clawed at me. What if they retaliated harder? What if they turned their last shred of influence into a weapon sharp enough to cut me down completely? Still, I knew the path was clear. Because this wasn't only about reclaiming what was stolen. It was about ending the cycle, about ensuring no one else fell victim to their lies. And as I signed the first set of legal papers, my hand shaking but steady enough to leave my mark, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted. It was no longer just whispers and manipulation in family kitchens. Now, it was courts, judges, laws. But before the gavel could ever fall, my parents made one last move, a move so ruthless it nearly destroyed everything I had built to this point. And I'll tell you exactly what that was in the next part. But before we get there, I want to hear from you. If you discovered your own family had stolen your future, would you expose them, even if it meant destroying them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This story is far from over, and you'll want to see how it ends. I thought filing charges would give me relief that finally, after years of manipulation, silence, and betrayal, justice was on my side. But I underestimated how far my parents were willing to go. The retaliation came fast and brutal. Within days of the lawsuit being filed, they weaponized the only thing they had left: lies. Suddenly, the headlines screamed my name, not as a whistleblower, not as a victim, but as a criminal. Unstable daughter invents fraud. Claims against family, one article read. Another labeled me a vengeful manipulator out to destroy her parents. Valerie went on camera, crocodile tears streaming down her face, claiming I'd always been jealous, always been unstable, painting me as a danger to the very grandparents I was protecting. The narrative was slick, rehearsed, and devastatingly effective. For a moment, I felt crushed under the weight of it. My phone buzzed with threats. Strangers spit venom online. Even neighbors eyed me with suspicion when I stepped outside. But then something unexpected happened. Cracks began to show. Journalists started digging deeper. Independent reporters reached out asking for the documents. When they saw the truth, when they followed the money trail, the narrative began to shift. And my parents, they panicked. For people who had always operated in the shadows of respectability, the glare of real scrutiny was blinding. I'll never forget the day federal investigators knocked on their door. The image of my father, once so powerful, so untouchable, being led out in handcuffs is burned into my memory. My mother, pale and shaking, refused to meet my eyes as cameras flashed. Valerie screamed at the officers, insisting it was all a mistake, but her voice cracked under the weight of fear. For me, though, it wasn't victory, not yet. It was survival. Because winning in court is a long, grinding process, and I knew they'd fight every step of the way. But the tide had turned. For the first time, I wasn't the one on trial in the court of public opinion. They were. And in the quiet after the chaos, as my grandparents and I sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where this story began, I realized something. Justice isn't clean. It's not cinematic. It's messy, painful, exhausting. But it's worth it. Because this fight was never just about money. It was about reclaiming my voice, about refusing to be erased, about saying you don't get to decide who I am. Now, months later, the case is ongoing. The headlines have shifted. Some people still doubt me, but many more stand with me. Survivors of financial abuse, of family betrayal, reach out daily telling me my fight gave them courage to start their own. And that's what I want you to take away from this. If you've been silenced, betrayed, or broken by those who should have loved you most, your story doesn't end there. You can rebuild. You can fight back. You can carve out freedom even when they try to chain you down. I'm living proof. Before I close, let me leave you with this. If this story resonated with you, don't let it fade. Share it, subscribe, and watch the next video, I've linked it. Dives into another case where someone turned betrayal into power. Because every time you watch, every time you comment, you're not just supporting me, you're amplifying a truth that people like my parents work hard to bury. And together we make sure it can't be silenced. And maybe that's the greatest justice of all, not just exposing the abusers, but refusing to let their lies define us ever again. When the dust finally settled, I found myself sitting in the garden behind my grandparents' house, listening to the wind rustle through the oak trees. The chaos of lawsuits, headlines, and betrayal felt far away in those moments. What remained was something quieter, something I hadn't felt in years, peace. I watched my grandparents laugh softly as they watered the roses, their faces lined not just with age, but with survival. They had carried secrets for so long, and now in the light of truth, their burdens seemed lighter. For the first time, I felt like we were truly a family, not one bound by lies, but by resilience. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Family is not defined by blood, but by trust. The people who love you will never demand your silence. They will never try to erase your identity or steal your freedom. True family stands beside you even when the world turns its back. In the months since I've rebuilt my life piece by piece. Some days are harder than others, but every step forward feels like reclaiming a part of myself I thought was gone forever. And in that rebuilding, I've discovered a strength I didn't know I had: the strength to walk away, the strength to speak out, and the strength to start again. If there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, it's this: betrayal can break you, but it doesn't have to define you. You are more than what was taken from you. You can rise, rebuild, and thrive. And if my story has given you even a spark of courage, then it was worth every painful step.